Welcome to Accreditation Conversations. I'm your host, Amy Dykens of Weave Education. Today, I had the opportunity to interview Dr. Tisha Paredes, who was the Assistant Vice President of Institutional Effectiveness at Old Dominion University for many years. In that capacity, we worked together, and I got to know Tisha better along the years. I've noticed that she was a very effective institutional effectiveness leader, and that she had a very practical approach both to accreditation as well as to assessment. And so I invited her to come on the show so that you could all have the opportunity to learn from her. Today, she is a consultant in the SAC-COC region, assisting institutions with their preparations for accreditation, as well as in the area of assessment of student learning and general education assessment. Today, you'll hear her speak about the need for folks to really engage in accreditation from the perspective of improvement, and it being something that is not intended to be a punitive process. Rather, it is something that has very intentionally been designed to stress institutions in a way that helps them identify opportunities for growth, innovation, and improvement. And it's a unique perspective that I think you'll enjoy hearing about. We also had the opportunity to talk about the experience of being a peer reviewer. And so many of us have had the opportunity to be reviewed as accreditors and then kind of seeing inside what's happening on the other side of that process can demystify what's happening, can really help you understand more clearly the expectations of the accreditor. And so it's interesting to hear Tisha talk about the growth that she saw as she became a reviewer and was volunteering her time to participate in those processes. Welcome to Accreditation Conversations. I'm your host, Amy Dykens of Weave, and I'm pleased today to be joined by Dr. Tisha Paredes. Tisha was somebody that I have worked with in the past, almost 10 years, I think, that we've known each other. It's kind of hard to believe at this point. But you were in the role at Old Dominion University as the Assistant Vice President of Institutional Effectiveness. And I know since then, you have also been highly involved in SAC-COC accreditations, that you continue as a consultant for folks who are going through that process. And that you've also worked with a lot of folks from a very practical perspective as an assessment consultant. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Amy.
So as we start our podcast today, I thought it would be very interesting for folks to hear a little bit from you on something that we talked about the other day. You have a very different perspective on something that some of us in accreditation probably would not have thought of, and that's that very dreaded ding from SACs. And so I would like to hear from you a little bit on, thinking about recommendations and, whether or not as a SACs consultant, when you encounter these, what is your reaction? What do you think about those?
Yeah, thank you, Amy. Yes, the dreaded ding, or perhaps in more formal terms, the follow-up report, the monitoring report, the recommendation, whatever language is used there. I think a lot of people get wrapped around themselves trying to be perfect in the accreditation process, right? They want to prove how good they are. But inherently, assessment is not about proving how good you are. It's about improving. And so the accreditation process is designed to stress the system so areas of improvement are identified. Now, notice that I use that term, areas of improvement, not areas that are terrible or areas that are failing, but areas of opportunity, areas of improvement. And I think it is really important to look at the ding as not you did bad or we're doing bad, but more as, okay, clearly this area needs my attention or the institution's attention. What can we do to help improve this area? And thank you, accreditors, for identifying that. And I know that sounds really silly. Thank you for showing me my flaw. But at the end of the day, we're learning organizations, right? We're constantly learning. Higher ed is a learning organization, constantly learning about themselves. So the idea that we're not perfect is not novel, right? We know we have our flaws. I think people get confused or maybe get a little too focused. I always think of there's two sides to this process. There's like a line down the middle of the letter A. And on one side of the A, there's accountability. And on the other side of the A, there's assessment. And accountability is to prove what we're doing, and assessment is to improve. And if people start thinking about the accreditation process as one side of the A, the assessment side of the A, that we're really looking to improve, I think that would be helpful. Yes, we are all good students who earn good grades in school, and we would like to continue to earn good grades throughout our career, but the reality is it's just not sustainable. And so getting a ding, and that's why I like to call it a ding, not a recommendation or a monitoring report, but a ding, just means that this area needs some attention, whether that's resources or time or some type of attention. I have encountered a few times in my career where there was a recommendation or a ding. And I want to be clear, unless it's something really egregious, like embezzlement of finances or something like that, typically a ding is not going to jeopardize the institution the first time. Now, if the institution does not respond to the ding, and of course the ding becomes more and more strong as time goes on, then there might be some problems. But the first time an area of opportunity is identified through a recommendation or a follow-up report, the institution probably will not lose its accreditation. So the idea that a ding is high stakes is not correct. It's not a high stakes, unless, of course, it's something really egregious. And typically, institutions do not commit those egregious errors.
Oh, very nice. You said something there that I want to explore just a little bit with you. The idea that accreditation is designed to stress the system, to expose the areas for improvement. Can you say just a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is a stressful process. I'm not going to lie to anybody, and anybody who's been through this is a stressful process. But it's inherently, the process is to peel back the layers, right? And it's supposed to really, really force people to study these areas of higher ed, these areas of the institution that we say we're doing, our processes and our policies and our practice. We say we're doing these things. Are we actually doing them? And when I mean by stress the system, I mean just that. You have to collect the data. You have to analyze the information for each area. You have to think about and really reflect, are we following our policies and practice? And this can be a very stressful time. It's stressful to reflect. Accreditation is really a reflection process. And as humans, we inherently do that. However, it's not always comfortable. And so, when we reflect, we are putting stress or we're putting focus on certain areas. And whether that's in our lives or at the institution, the whole process of reflection is designed to really focus on some areas and make sure that you're studying those areas so you can see whether or not you're following your practices, policies, and any other institutional guidelines that you have. So that's what I mean about stressing the system. It is designed to make us study ourselves and reflect. And that can be a stressful process sometimes.
Oh, excellent. It's interesting being an educational organization, and we are all about learning. Sometimes when we have to turn that learning process on ourselves, it's very uncomfortable, right? But if we think about this from the perspective of great learning theory and organizational learning, the things that we know work well for students, right? Sometimes it's not until the point where they are uncomfortable, right, that you can tell that they're finally learning, right? And so it seems like there's a lot of parallels there. Really, it's designed to be a process that assists you, like you said, with that reflection on what have we been doing, but also to give you the opportunity to like really push folks past what's comfortable
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
so that they can be in that area of innovation and improvement. I love that you are reframing the thinking around something that folks naturally react to very poorly, right? And reframing it as something that this is an opportunity. This is not all a bad thing, even though it might feel like it right at first. It's all about how we react to failure.
Mm-hmm.
It's all about how we react to, somebody saying, here's some really strong feedback for you, really.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so
Yeah.
thank you so much for sharing a very different perspective on that for us. So, if I was somebody on a campus and I am in the situation where I'm starting to realize we're probably we're weak in an area, maybe I even realized that before we're turning in our report to our accreditor, or maybe it's being exposed as the reviewers are going through their process and they're starting to ask harder and harder questions that we don't have the answers to. What can I do in that situation? What would your advice be to those folks at that point?
Yes, breathe. I think is the first thing. Yes, first thing is to take a second and breathe. You can get very wrapped up in the process and think it's life or death type of situation. And I don't mean to minimize it, but I had a great mentor when I was working at Old Dominion, and he used to end the day by saying, did anybody die today? And I don't mean to minimize the situation about death or anything like that. What he was doing was putting it in perspective for me.
Mm-hmm.
And so I didn't lose my job. I didn't lose $1 million. That he could have said, "Did you lose $1 million today?" And so I think first thing is to breathe. The second thing is to think about what can you do that's reasonable and sustainable. And I use those words very purposefully. If you are coming up on an accreditation visit, and we all know, for people who are listening or watching, we all know this person, you're coming up on an accreditation visit, and it's Chicken Little. The sky is falling, and we have to coerce people into doing the right thing, the way we want it. If they're not completing their assessment reports, then we must have a power coercive type idea to get everybody on board, to force people to do things. And we all know that when you force people to do things, what happens after that pressure is gone? They tend to move back, right? And so when I say reasonable and sustainable, that's what I mean. What can you reasonably get done that will not jeopardize your health, first of all, but it will not jeopardize the relationships that go on in the institution, the professional relationships across people, across departments, across different divisions. That does not jeopardize trust or anything like that. And then sustainable, this is not about accreditation. What you do is not about accreditation. It's what's best for the students and what's best for the organization. So don't do something short term that's just for accreditation. And as soon as the reviewers leave campus, you'll just go back to doing business as usual. So I think that it's really important. First, breathe. We're probably not going to lose $1 million today. And then second of all, what is reasonable and sustainable? The other piece of this is have a real serious conversation with leadership. We are in this position because, okay? And this is what we can do to get out of this position in general. I wouldn't even say for accreditation. We are in this position because, and this is what we can do to get out of this position. We are in this position typically because there's not a lot of investment that goes on until you're 2 years out from accreditation. And all of a sudden you get that email from SAC COC or whomever, and all of a sudden You need to put more resources into assessment, or put more resources into accreditation, or make sure you have these policies, when we should be doing this all along. If we're not investing in these practices and monitoring these practices all along, then accreditation feels, it feels like this great big burden. And I shared with you this story earlier about if you don't brush your teeth for a year and you go for your yearly checkup to the dentist, well, most likely, maybe not that year, the dentist will find something, maybe the second year, but eventually your teeth are going to be bad if you don't do the preventative care. It's the same with accreditation, right? And assessment and all IE kind of practices. If you do not do that preventative maintenance, for lack of a better phrase, when it comes to that checkup, that accreditation visit, things are not going to go well. And so leaders and institutional members can really think about, institutional professionals can really think about, how do we do that preventative maintenance along the way, so that when I do have that dentist checkup, they're not pulling teeth or anything like that.
Excellent. Yeah. I love that analogy. It's spot on, and it makes me think too about the fact that it is sometimes misunderstood. It feels like around accreditation and these processes, that the accreditor is not requiring things of you that they have imagined, will be something that they think is just hard to do, or, let's, invent something that, is going to torture you, even though it might feel like that sometimes. They're really, they're peer reviewed standards. And by peer reviewed, that is other experts that are your colleagues at institutions across the nation, and in some cases the world, have said this is the bare minimum that it takes to be a viable, quality higher education institution. And I think folks forget along the way, or maybe they've never really taken the time to reflect on that this is, you're meeting the standards of care, if you will, that have been set, because we know that's what's good for your institution, to help you have a healthy institution.
Right.
So thinking about that peer review process, and the fact that this is something that is really driven by peers, it's interesting recently that in conversations with accreditation organizations, it feels like there's been a theme of, we are really struggling with making sure that we have great evaluation teams that we can put together for this peer review process. And that feels dangerous to me, that we're hearing that from accreditors. And so I'm wondering, what your thoughts are on that. Is this a problem? And, is there anything that we can do about it?
Yeah, I have heard that over the years as well, that there aren't enough evaluators, trained evaluators in a database or to pull from, especially in the IE fields, or maybe the academic fields like reviewing faculty or something like that. This is an interesting problem, right? Because the beauty of this process, as you said, is that it's peer review. And that means that professionals who live and breathe this work are reviewing areas that they're familiar with, right? This is not somebody from the outside who perhaps attended college, thinks they know about college just because they took a college class or two. These are people that live and breathe the college life and understand the realities. And so the idea that we don't have enough peer reviewers, I think, is a little sad, because we do need to keep the system going. We certainly don't want outsiders coming in and doing this work. The other piece of that is peer review for me. When I started getting involved in doing being a SAC-COC evaluator, for me, it made the accreditation process from like Tisha, the professional, less scary. because
Mm.
I got to see how the other reviewers look at the areas. I got to see how there's a lot of care and thought about talking about, oh, well, the institution mentioned this and they're trying to do this, and we spoke to them on site, and this is the information we have. At the end of the day, the onus is on the institution to provide the information. Reviewers cannot assume, but there was a lot of thoughtful conversations around that. And so, it was really important for me to see that before I went through my accreditation cycle at my institution. And I think I know people's jobs, I know why people don't do it. Their lives are busy, their work lives are busy, their personal lives are busy. It does take a lot of time. However, this is a great professional development personally, but also it's really good for your institution. And I would encourage people to talk to their leadership. If you're a few years out from your accreditation, even if you're not, even if you just went through accreditation, wherever you are in the cycle, talk with your leadership. This is important to the institution. And this is another way to invest, right? This is another way to invest in the people this time, not just the infrastructure. So bringing that knowledge to campus kind of demystifies the process, or at least hopefully demystifies the process. And yeah, I do think it is a problem that we don't have a lot of these people in the database. And hopefully this encourages people to think about becoming a reviewer for their accrediting body.
So if I wanted to become a reviewer for an accreditation body, what would be my steps? How would I do that?
Yeah, it really is dependent on the accrediting body. However, for the six regionals, the process is typically the same. And when I talk about the six regionals, I'm talking about Higher Learning Commission, Middle States, SAC-CRC. The process is typically the same, wherein you have a point of contact on your campus. They're usually the accreditation liaison, whatever they're called in your organization, and they are the conduit. They are the person that talks with the accreditation organization officially. I would go to him or her and I would say, I would like to become a reviewer. Can we start the process? And typically that process entails getting the president's signature. It's not as scary as you think it is. I think that deters some people as well, because they're like, oh, I have to talk to the president. No, you actually don't have to talk to the president of your institution. You just have to state your interest. And I would also state your interest in kind of the context of how would this help the institution? This is an investment in people, and this would help the institution. How? And I would talk to your accreditation liaison and ask them to facilitate that conversation or that process for you. You also probably need to fill out a short application, which is just usually a listing of your credentials. So it's not like you're getting admitted to college and you need to write this huge, why I wanted to go to college essay or anything like that. But you do need to state at least why it would be beneficial to the institution, at least internally to your accreditation liaison.
Nice. And it's interesting too. As you said, it feels like it demystifies so many things, right? You can really have a very clear understanding of what your institution is preparing for, and what the like black box of now the report has gone to the review team really is all about. And I think it de-escalates some of that nervousness and that stress for folks once they are able to see the other side of what's happening, and how very careful and thoughtful the majority of review teams are as they're thinking about the evidence and all, and how respectful I've seen them be of the very hard work that institutions are doing, not only every day, but also in preparing for these events. I will say that from my perspective, whenever I was a reviewer, I was always able to come away from those not only feeling more, prepared for our own events, but I learned so much. I had the opportunity to see, innovation and wonderful student experiences and things that I never would have been able to see across institutions that were similar to mine, but also very different in many many ways.
I think that's a really interesting point, and a really good point. You're right. When I was doing reviews, and you get to see different practices. And that's the beauty of the higher ed community, right? We typically share everything with colleagues, right? And the other piece of this review that just occurred to me when you were talking was that accrediting bodies are actually extremely transparent. People may not think that they are because there are some legalities, right? We should not talk about institutions that we've reviewed. We should not talk about specifics, so those kinds of things. But the reality is anybody in higher ed can be a reviewer. Anybody can be an observer. Every time I was on a team, you had an observer who was technically not part of the team, but got to observe, as the name indicates. And sometimes they would help out depending on the situation. So the process is actually really transparent. It's just that it's done off-site, or it's done in a hotel room where people maybe think it's not transparent. But I think these organizations try to make the process transparent within the legal possibilities, obviously.
Excellent. And as you said earlier, there are, of course, many things to do with accreditation that are about accountability. And that transparency is part of meeting the accountability needs of the stakeholders that higher education is serving. But that also leads us to assessment.
I don't know, some of the people listening will remember when SAC-COC was counts of books in the library, or counts of number of faculty with PhDs or terminal degrees or something like that, but basically counts, metrics, all accountability measures. When they switched in 2012 to the then called new standards, they have even newer standards now in 2018, but then the new standards, you could see a shift in the mindset from accountability to more assessment type things. Tell us that your faculty are credentialed. Tell us that your library services are appropriate. Those sorts of things, instead of counts, that where you either hit it or not. It's the black or white kind of it, not it rubric. So in that shift, right, then institutions with greater kind of leeway comes more responsibility, right? So institutions had to figure this out. And in that decade or so, since the standards changed from metrics, I think institutions have really shifted from assessment as being this mandatory, I have to hit these marks kind of thing, to it's just the way we do business now. It's just part of the culture. Now, not everybody likes to do assessment, student learning assessment, but it's just part of the culture. And I think when SAC-COC really shifted and focused on, especially that assessment of student learning that you talked about, where it's not, you must hit these certain targets, but more of tell us how well students are learning, then people started saying, oh, okay, well, we can now think about, we did not hit that target. How do we improve? And that's the whole tenet of assessment. You don't meet your target, or it's partially met. How do you improve? And so maybe I'm biased because I spent my career in a SAC-COC school in the southern region. But I do think they were the leaders in this. I saw a lot of specialized accreditations kind of follow suit with the focus on student learning assessment. Because at the end of the day, it's not really about the number of books that you have in the library. It's about how well you're supporting students and how well they are developing or learning. And are you doing that, and how well are you doing that? And that's really important. So while I cannot give you hard data, and I know some of my colleagues out there in assessment land are collecting some of these data, I can't specifically say, yes, we have improved student learning. There is a general sense that we are aware of how well we are supporting students, and we are aware of how well we're helping students learn. Ultimately, it's up to them on whether or not they learn. But I think as higher ed as a whole, I think accreditation has pushed us to really think about how well we are helping students develop and learn. And I think that's important.
Excellent. I love what you're saying there about thinking of, there may not be, that hard data today. We're working on it, honestly, but there is definitely a cultural shift that we have seen over the years, and having that valuable conversation on campus about students that we are not seeing be successful, having a conversation that's honest about what is it that we are doing well and what are our strengths, and what is it that we are not doing well, so that we can focus on it and do something intentional to improve that student experience, that student learning opportunity. I think that transformation has been something that has come, really across higher education in the last decade. We don't see those conversations as strongly on campus today. We don't want to talk about
Right.
that we're not doing
Mm-hmm.
something for students.
Mm-hmm.
A safer space, perhaps,
Mm-hmm.
for that learning and stretching and being aware of things. And I've even seen institutions, it's very interesting, where you have that aha moment of, oh, 5 years ago we were doing well at that,
Right.
and so we stopped paying attention to it.
Right.
And as a result, now, it has suffered from inattention.
Mm-hmm.
So what do we do now about it? That now that we know, we have to put time and effort into that again. But that cultural shift of not being really allowed to say, sometimes we think we're not doing a good job for our students,
Yeah,
feels very important.
I think you're absolutely right. Remember, the assessment field was born out of this idea of return on investment, right? That
Mm-hmm.
ROI that federal and state governments wanted to know about because they gave money to higher ed institutions back in the 80s. They wanted to know what was their return on investments, and that's how the assessment field was sort of, it was not exactly how it was born, but kind of filtered throughout higher ed, right? We need to collect information. Over the last decade, I have not heard, and this is fascinating to me because early in my career, in the early 2000s, I heard a lot of this return on investment. In the last decade or so, I have not heard that phrase at all coming out of leadership, out of the accreditors, out of people on campus. It's more of, like you said, that very student focus. Are we helping students? Are we supporting students? How do we know? And how can we do better? Those very fundamental questions that assessment can help us answer. And I think there has been a shift to that culture. It's exciting to see. It's exciting to see.
It is exciting. It's exciting to be a part of.
I
Absolutely.
think what I saw later on, and I see it now with other assessment professionals. Um, Early on, sometimes you have to be that assessment salesperson, like you're constantly selling assessment.
Mm-hmm.
But at some point, there was a shift where we became assessment consultants, and so yes, we still had to talk about the benefits of assessment and still had to bring people along, but we weren't selling assessment that hard anymore. We now talking about how can we help you? How can we support you? And that shift has been nice to see it in the field as well, professionally.
Very nice. And so if I happen to be one of those folks on a campus where I don't feel like we're quite there
Yeah,
yet,
right.
I'm hearing Tisha and Amy talk about something that it's like, wow, I don't think we really actually have that culture. What would you recommend to them?
Yeah, you're not alone. You're not alone. I think people are probably not going to like this, but part of the journey is the journey, right? It's not always about the end when you achieve nirvana. It's about the journey a little bit, and that is actually inherently assessment. What can you do about that? I think you can take a step back and really think about why. That I love the why. My boss told me one time I asked why a lot. So why are we not there? And what support mechanisms, what things can be done to get us there? And I get it. Institutions are strapped for resources, for money, for time. What can be done within the current context? And what can be done with just an infusion of a little bit of resources? What can we do to reformat maybe position descriptions, or maybe reformat areas, offices? Instead of creating something new that costs a lot of money, what can we do within the system? So I think pausing and really thinking about why we're not there and what can we do to get there, and thinking about those practical steps. The other piece is talk to colleagues. I know conferences are online now, and it's a little bit more difficult to network. One day we'll be back in person. But when you go to these conferences, you will see you're not alone, but you'll also grab some really good ideas. And so baby steps. What can I control? What can I do? And what ideas can I implement either from somebody else or my own ideas? And how do I take baby steps? Creating a culture of assessment is hard. And I spent almost 20 years at an institution, 15 of them in an assessment office. I would like to think that we had a culture of assessment, but I would also say that's probably somebody's career to develop a culture of assessment. And so what metrics are you looking at? Is it that people don't complain about assessment, or is it that people do their assessment and have improvements based on actions, and kind of think of that as a continuum? Thinking about maybe you could do a rubric and create a rubric on the culture of assessment and have little smiley faces or frowny faces along the way. But no, seriously, baby steps, and you're not alone. And it is about the journey. I know a lot of people won't like that kind of answer, but it really is about the process. It's not always about the ends.
Excellent. I love that. And you always are so very good about thinking about the practical approach, right? It takes time, it takes effort, but the journey starts with a step, right? So take a step, do what you can, is always great advice, as opposed to like getting overwhelmed and stuck because you see how far it is to that ideal that you would like to reach. So
yeah.
Excellent advice.
Yeah, I think we get so wrapped up in this is the ideal and this is the way I want to be, or this is how I want our culture to be. But the reality is that ideal, cultures grow. We're living organizations, right? And so that ideal may not fit the institutional culture in 3 years, right? So you have to constantly be rethinking. Yes, you have to have a goal in mind, but you have to constantly be rethinking, is this appropriate to the culture? Is this something that's useful? If not, how can I shift my ideal? The other piece of this is, somebody told me, actually, when I was writing my dissertation, they used this metaphor, and I'm sure people have heard it before. And I used to think this was I used to tell this to my staff members. Assessment work can actually be like eating an elephant, and so there are some parts of the elephant, or eating, let's say, perhaps a cow or what another animal, and there are some parts of the animal that are tender and juicy, and you love to eat them. And then there are other parts of the animal that just are hard to stomach and not really, they don't really taste good. And I actually don't eat a lot of meat. So this analogy is difficult for me, but I think people get the point, right? I mean, if you want to eat, if you look at your job in assessment and creating a culture of assessment as you just take one bite at a time, and sometimes they're good bites and sometimes they're not so good bites, but eventually you'll get there. So I think that's important to keep in mind.
Yeah, that's perfect. I love it. So as we think about folks out there who are listening, I always like to ask folks when we're talking, what is it that you're reading today? What is it that you would recommend to others if they're interested in learning more for themselves? What would you share with them?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, if people are not at the minimum skimming the headlines of like the Inside Higher Ed Daily or the Chronicle Daily, I try to do that every day. Sometimes I actually read a full article if I have time. I try to get a couple in each week, but that's at the minimum. Before I left Old Dominion, I really got into looking at how we as institutions can do better. So one book that I really focused on, which helped some institutional processes, was prioritizing academic programs and services or units or something like that. And basically, the premise is, we only have a certain amount of resources as institutions. Where are our priorities? From there, I shifted into really thinking about becoming. It's out of, I believe it's out of AAC&U, becoming a student-ready college. And there were prompts in that book of, are your policies and practices focused on the student, or have you shifted and focused on other things? And so, kind of going back to what I was saying, if you're just doing this for accreditation, that's wrong. You need to refocus on the student. So those are two really interesting books to kind of take a look at the bigger picture. If you want to feel good about assessment, there's a really good book that's that I enjoy, that I actually have been flipping through recently. Improving, I think it's Improving Assessments in Higher Education. It's a few years old, but they're essentially case studies, and they're case studies in notoriously. I probably shouldn't say notoriously. They're case studies in disciplines that perhaps don't always do assessment well, or perhaps are a little bit hesitant to participate in the assessment process. And it talks about how institutions got these it's all different disciplines and institutions, how institutions got these different disciplines on board, and how they actually made improvements in student learning. And that's more of a feel-good book. Well, maybe, I don't know, if you're an assessment nerd, maybe that is a feel-good book, but I think it's hopeful. It's a little bit more hopeful than some of those other books.
Nice. I like it. And being able to be inspired that
Yes.
we can make a difference for students is always a nice way to kind of end your thinking around, this is my position. I'm leading institutional effectiveness. I'm a director of assessment. I'm working on accreditation. But in the end, to take it back to, and how does all of this impact the promises that we've made to students?
Yeah. At the end of the day, are we making good on our promise? And how do we know? That's the most important thing.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So if anybody who's listening would like to get in touch with you to have an extended conversation to learn more, how should they do that?
Yeah, well, I do have a LinkedIn profile, so they can go find me on my LinkedIn profile. So it's Tisha Paredes, and hopefully there's only one Tisha Paredes out there on the LinkedIn profile. Or they can email me. It's Tisha Paredes. It's T, my last name, Paredes @odu.edu. And I'd be happy to have a conversation with somebody.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
It was excellent to hear from Tisha today. She had some really practical advice to share. I was especially appreciative of our conversation around assessment today, and thinking about how many strides we've made over the years in the culture of assessment on campuses and higher education in general. She has been a strong voice in improvement efforts and really getting value out of accreditation and assessment over the years. And I found her input on taking, eating the elephant one bite at a time is frequently how we see folks be successful in these very complicated, stressful, overwhelming sometimes processes that you're leading on campus. And so I take that to heart. I really hope that folks take away from her conversation that it wasn't always easy, right? But staying at it, continuing to fight the fight, and that you're building relationships on campus that need to last the long term. So don't force things too far so that you break relationships. Rather, take it in stride and continue to make improvements over time. And when you look back 5-10 years from now, you'll be amazed by the progress that you've made in this area. I also agree completely with her on the need for folks to step up and participate in the peer review process. We encourage our listeners to go out there and find out how you can become involved by becoming peer reviewers for your accreditation organizations. It's a time commitment, but you will get so much value, not only for your institution in the learning process, but you will also professionally gain value by getting the opportunity to see inside of other organizations. And the peer review process and accreditation will be enhanced by having more folks who are actively engaged in the conversations around quality and improvement in higher education. Have a wonderful day.